As the elevator descended, Brian's thoughts churned. He had no idea how much time he had, or if Marvin had managed to confront Mateo yet. His only hope lay in the board's resolve to act swiftly. He needed them to hold Mateo accountable before everything unraveled completely. When the doors slid open, Brian was greeted by the dimly lit expanse of the basement. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint mechanical hum of the hotel's inner workings. It was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that amplified every creak and shuffle. But the isolation was a relief. It gave him a chance to think, to breathe, even if only for a moment. Brian moved through the maze of corridors, his footsteps echoing softly against the concrete floor. He eventually found a small, forgotten storage room tucked away in the farthest corner. The room was cluttered with old linens, battered cleaning supplies, and unused equipment, but it offered the seclusion he needed. No one would think to look for him here. He slipped inside, carefully closing the door behind him. Leaning against the wall, Brian exhaled deeply, trying to steady his racing heart. The faint hum of machinery outside the room was the only sound, a stark contrast to the tension that had consumed him upstairs. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching endlessly as Brian paced the cramped space. His mind was a whirlwind of worry and uncertainty. What was happening upstairs? Had Marvin confronted Mateo yet? Was the board acting on the evidence, or was it already too late? Every faint sound outside the room, a distant footstep, the low rumble of the service elevator, made his chest tighten with fear. What if Mateo had already pieced everything together? What if he was on his way? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Brian's phone vibrated in his pocket. His heart leapt as he fished it out, his hands trembling slightly. It was a message from Marvin. "Meeting's over. Mateo knows. It's time." Brian's stomach churned as he read the words. Mateo knew. The board had confronted him, and the truth was out. But Marvin's cryptic message left Brian uneasy. What did "it's time" mean? Was the board taking action, or had Mateo managed to deflect their accusations? Before Brian could fully process the message, his phone buzzed again. This time it was from Grace. "Mateo is looking for you. He's furious. Be careful." The weight of her warning settled over him like a shroud. The confrontation had begun, but Brian knew the danger wasn't over. Mateo was a man backed into a corner, and there was no telling what he might do next. Brian Henry's heart raced as he read Grace's message. He had anticipated that Mateo would come for him, but knowing the board was now aware of the truth made the situation even more volatile. Mateo was cornered, and a man like him wouldn't go down quietly. Desperation had a way of turning dangerous. Slipping out of the cramped storage room, Brian moved swiftly through the maze of basement corridors. The dim lighting cast long shadows, but he kept his movements precise and silent, his ears tuned to every faint noise. He needed to leave the hotel, but Mateo would have people searching every corner. His only chance was to stay ahead of the chaos. When Brian reached the service elevators, he pressed the call button and waited, his pulse quickening with each passing second. Every noise, distant footsteps, the hum of machinery, set his nerves on edge. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, half expecting Mateo or Judy to emerge from the shadows. The tension felt unbearable. Finally, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Brian stepped inside, pressing the button for the lobby. He drew a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew he couldn't remain hidden forever. At some point, a confrontation with Mateo was inevitable. He just needed to be ready when that moment arrived. The ride to the lobby stretched endlessly, the soft hum of the elevator amplifying the sound of his pounding heartbeat. The walls seemed to close in on him as his mind raced. Mateo was on the hunt, angry, desperate, and fully aware that the board was now armed with evidence against him. What Mateo might do in such a state was anyone's guess. As the elevator neared the lobby, Brian's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out to see another message from Grace. "He's on the warpath, Brian. He's tearing through the hotel looking for you. I'm trying to keep him distracted, but I don't know how much longer I can hold him off." Brian exhaled sharply, his chest tightening. Grace was risking herself to buy him time, and the clock was ticking. The moment of reckoning was drawing closer, and Brian had to think fast. Mateo's wrath was closing in, but Brian refused to let fear dictate his next move. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire hotel and everyone Mateo had trampled along the way. When the elevator doors finally opened, Brian stepped out, his resolve hardening. It was time to face whatever was waiting for him. Brian Henry's breath caught in his throat as the voice echoed through the hallway. The sharp, commanding tone left no doubt who it belonged to. He turned slowly, his heart thundering in his chest, and met the piercing gaze of Mateo. The man stood at the opposite end of the corridor, his presence filling the space with a palpable tension. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations, and a dangerous undercurrent of anger. Mateo's dark eyes bore into Brian, filled with a fury that was barely restrained. "Henry," Mateo said again, his voice lower but no less menacing. He took a step forward, his polished shoes echoing on the tiled floor. "I've been looking for you." Brian clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. He couldn't let Mateo see his fear. "What do you want, Mateo?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Mateo smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been busy, haven't you? Stirring up trouble where it doesn't belong." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before taking another deliberate step closer. "Do you really think you can outmaneuver me? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Brian's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. There was no point in arguing with Mateo. The man wasn't looking for a conversation, he was looking for control. The silence stretched between them, each second feeling like an eternity. Brian's mind raced, searching for a way to diffuse the situation or, at the very least, buy himself more time. He couldn't afford to confront Mateo directly, not yet. "You're awfully quiet," Mateo said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're realizing you've made a mistake." He took another step forward, his expression hardening. "Let me make something clear, Henry. You're playing a dangerous game, and you won't win." Brian straightened his posture, meeting Mateo's gaze head-on. "Maybe you should think about who's playing the dangerous game, Mateo," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "You can't keep running things the way you have. People are starting to notice." Mateo's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of anger. He stepped closer, now just a few feet away, his expression cold and calculating. "You're in over your head," he hissed. "If you think the board can save you, you're more foolish than I thought." Brian held his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Mateo was trying to intimidate him, to break his resolve, but Brian also knew that Mateo's anger meant he was losing control. The board had seen the evidence. Marvin had confronted him. Mateo was cornered, and he knew it. "Maybe I am," Brian said evenly, "but that doesn't mean I'm wrong." For a moment, Mateo said nothing, his jaw tightening as his hands curled into fists. Then, without another word, he turned sharply and strode away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Brian exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief. He knew this wasn't over. Mateo was dangerous, and he wouldn't go down without a fight, but for now, Brian had managed to hold his ground. He had bought himself a little more time, and he intended to use it wisely. Mateo's face contorted with unbridled rage. The tension in the hallway was so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. His eyes burned with a venomous intensity as he took a menacing step toward Brian, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The fury radiating from him was almost tangible, and Brian could tell this confrontation had become deeply personal. Mateo peered down at Brian, his face covered with foaming rage. and he shouted things at Noah through his teeth. "You think you can destroy me?" Matteo growled, his voice low, seething with barely restrained anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and take everything I've worked for?" Brian held his ground, though his heart pounded in his chest. There was no use in pretending now. Matteo knew the truth, and there was no turning back from this moment. "This isn't about ruining you," Brian replied, his voice calm despite the storm of emotions churning inside him. "It's about saving this hotel. You've been stealing from the business, dismantling everything my father built, and turning this place into a shadow of what it used to be." Matteo's lips curled into a sneer, his face twisted with contempt. "You don't know the first thing about how this business works. You think running to the board is going to fix anything? You're just like your father. Soft, too weak to make the hard choices." The insult hit Brian like a punch to the gut. He had spent his life trying to honor his father's legacy, trying to prove to himself and the world that he could live up to the man who had built Henry Plaza from nothing. Hearing Matteo demean his father's memory ignited a fire within Brian he hadn't felt in years. "You don't get to talk about my father," Brian said coldly, his eyes narrowing. "He created this hotel with integrity, treating his staff like family. You're the one tearing it apart, piece by piece." Matteo took another step forward, his expression darkening into something almost sinister. "Your father was a naive fool," he spat. "He thought kindness and respect could build an empire. But empires are built by those strong enough to make sacrifices, to make the tough calls. That's why I'm here, and why you'll never measure up." Brian clenched his fists, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He knew Matteo was trying to bait him, to push him into reacting emotionally. But Brian also knew that losing control would only play into Matteo's hands. "This is over, Matteo," Brian said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The board has the evidence. They know what you've done, and they're going to act. Your time here is finished." For a fleeting moment, fear flickered across Matteo's face. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Brian saw it. The man quickly masked it with his usual cold, calculated demeanor, but the crack in his armor was there. "You really think the board is going to save you?" Matteo sneered, his tone dripping with derision. "I've been running this place for years. I know every loophole, every angle. By the time they figure out what to do, it'll be too late. And I'll make sure of it." Brian's heart pounded harder, a chill creeping up his spine at the venom in Matteo's words. This wasn't just a desperate man clinging to power. Matteo was calculating, ruthless, and utterly unafraid to burn everything down to protect himself. "I'm not afraid of you," Brian said, his voice steady and resolute. "And I won't let you destroy my father's legacy." For a brief moment, Matteo's face twisted with pure hatred, and Brian braced himself, half expecting the man to lunge at him. But instead, Matteo let out a cold, bitter laugh that echoed down the empty hallway. "You're a fool, Henry," Matteo said, shaking his head as if in disbelief. "You don't have what it takes to finish this, and that's why you'll lose." With that, Matteo turned abruptly and strode down the corridor, his footsteps echoing ominously. The tension in the air didn't dissipate. It lingered like a dark cloud, suffocating and heavy. Brian stood frozen for a moment, his fists still clenched, his heart hammering in his chest. He had expected Matteo to lash out, to escalate the confrontation into something more physical. Instead, Matteo had walked away, leaving behind a sense of unease that made Brian's stomach churn. This wasn't over. Matteo was planning something. Whatever it was, Brian knew it wouldn't be good. He had to stay vigilant. The fight to save Henry Plaza wasn't finished. Not yet. Brian Henry trudged back to the staff break room, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. The confrontation with Matteo had rattled him more than he cared to admit. He had believed that exposing Matteo to the board would mark the beginning of the end, that the evidence would be enough to dismantle his grip on the Henry Plaza Hotel. But now, that certainty was slipping through his fingers like sand. Matteo wasn't just any adversary. He was cunning, ruthless, and deeply entrenched. Years of manipulating the system had made him an expert in navigating its vulnerabilities. With Judy standing loyally by his side, shielding him at every turn, Matteo's power felt impenetrable. Brian couldn't help but wonder if he had underestimated the fight ahead. As he pushed open the break room door, he found Grace already there, her face tight with worry. She looked up the moment he entered, her anxiety plain to see. "What happened?" she asked softly, her voice laced with concern. Brian dropped into the chair across from her, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I confronted him," he admitted, his tone weary. "He knows everything, Grace, and he's not backing down. If anything, he's more dangerous now than ever." Grace's face paled at his words. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brian stared at the table between them, his mind racing through the possibilities. They couldn't afford to sit back and wait for the board to act. Matteo was already plotting his next move, and if they didn't act quickly, they would lose what little advantage they had. "We need to stay ahead of him," Brian said at last, his voice resolute. "Matteo isn't going to go down without a fight, but we can't let him destroy this place. We have to figure out what he's planning and stop him before he does any more damage." Grace nodded slowly, though the tension in her face remained. "But how? He's already watching us, Brian. If we slip up, he'll come after us." Brian's gaze met hers, his determination unwavering. "We won't get caught," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We'll be careful. We don't have another choice." Grace bit her lip, worry etched into every line of her face. "I'm with you," she said, after a long pause, her voice firm despite the apprehension in her eyes. "But this is dangerous, Brian. Matteo isn't going to let this go." "I know," Brian replied, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. "But we can't let him win, not after everything he's done. To the hotel, to the staff, to my father's legacy. We owe it to everyone here to see this through." Grace gave him a small nod, her worry mingling with a spark of resolve. "Then let's do it, whatever it takes." Brian felt a flicker of gratitude for her unwavering support. The battle ahead was fraught with risks, but he wasn't fighting alone. He wasn't going to let Matteo tear down everything his father had worked so hard to build. It was time to fight back. Brian Henry sat in the dimly lit break room, his thoughts spiraling with the weight of the past few days. The air around him felt heavy, almost stifling, as if the walls of the Henry Plaza Hotel were closing in. Matteo had been exposed to the board, but his grip on the hotel remained unbroken. The man's cold, calculated words from their confrontation still reverberated in Brian's mind. They weren't mere threats, they were warnings, laced with the promise of retaliation. Matteo wasn't the type to wait passively. Desperation made him even more unpredictable, and Brian knew time was running out. If they didn't act soon, Matteo would find a way to spin the situation back into his favor, evidence or not. Across the table, Grace sat silently, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the surface. Her expression mirrored Brian's own unease. She hadn't said much since he recounted his encounter with Matteo, but the concern in her eyes spoke volumes. She understood the stakes. They both did. "We need to figure out Matteo's next move," Brian said, breaking the tense silence. His voice was low, steady, though a current of urgency ran beneath his words. "He's not going to sit back and wait for the board to act. He'll strike first, and we need to be ready." Grace nodded slowly, though her face remained tense. "How do we even begin to figure that out? He's already watching us, and Judy's got her eyes on everyone. If we slip up—" She didn't finish, but the implication hung in the air. Brian leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. His mind worked furiously to connect the pieces of the puzzle. "We need someone close to him, someone who knows his plans," he said, his voice firm. "If we can find out what he's up to, We can stop him before he has the chance to act. Grace's brow furrowed, her thoughts visibly racing. "What about Judy?" she asked after a moment. "She's been his closest ally from the start. If anyone knows what he's planning, it's her." Brian hesitated, considering her words. Judy had been Matteo's confidant and enforcer, protecting him and ensuring his schemes went undetected. If they could uncover her secrets, they might have a chance. But the risk of going after Judy was enormous. She was sharp, always on guard. "It's dangerous," Brian said, his tone cautious. "But you're right, Judy's the key. If we can figure out what she knows." He trailed off, weighing the risks in his mind. Grace shifted in her seat, her voice hesitant as she interrupted his thoughts. "Brian, there's something I need to tell you." He looked at her, noting the nervous tension in her posture. Grace glanced around the room, her eyes scanning for anyone who might overhear. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "I overheard something earlier today. One of the housekeepers was talking to Judy. She mentioned a meeting Matteo is having tomorrow night." Brian's heart skipped a beat. "A meeting? With who?" Grace shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know, the housekeeper didn't say much, but it sounded important. Judy told her to keep it quiet, to make sure no one else knew about it." Brian's mind raced. A secret meeting? Matteo was plotting something, and this could be their chance to uncover it. Whatever the meeting was about, it wasn't good, and they couldn't afford to ignore it. Brian Henry's thoughts raced as he absorbed what Grace had told him. Matteo's secret meeting could be the opportunity they had been waiting for, a chance to uncover his next move before it was too late. If they could learn the details in time, they might be able to stop him from causing further damage. "We need to find out where and when this meeting is happening," Brian said, his voice firm with urgency. "If Matteo is planning something, this could be our best shot at stopping him." Grace nodded, though worry lingered in her expression. "But how do we get close without drawing attention? Judy's been watching everyone like a hawk." Brian paused, considering their options. Following Matteo or Judy directly would be too obvious and would only make them targets. They needed a subtler approach, a way to gather information without tipping anyone off. His mind raced through the possibilities, weighing the risks. "I'll talk to some of the staff," Brian said finally, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. "There are still people here who believe in what my father stood for. If they've overheard anything, it could help us figure out where this meeting is taking place." Grace nodded, determination slowly replacing her apprehension. "All right, I'll keep an eye on Judy. If she acts out of the ordinary or says anything that might give us a lead, I'll let you know." Brian felt a flicker of hope. They were getting closer to the truth, inching toward a chance to bring Matteo down for good. But he knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. Matteo's paranoia was growing, and any slip-up could cost them everything. The hours that followed were tense, filled with careful, hushed conversations and stolen glances. Brian approached a few trusted staff members, those who had remained loyal to his father's vision for the Henry Plaza. Many were hesitant to speak, the weight of Matteo's intimidation heavy in their voices. The fear of retribution was almost palpable, but a handful of them opened up, offering snippets of information that hinted at something bigger. "Matteo's been in and out of the executive wing all day," one staff member whispered to Brian when they crossed paths in the service corridor. "I heard Judy mention something about the conference room on the top floor." Another staff member, a longtime concierge named Betty, shared what she had overheard earlier. Judy was talking to one of the housekeeping supervisors. She said the room needed to be cleared and locked after 8 p.m. tonight. Whatever's happening, they're making sure no one interrupts. Brian filed away every detail, piecing together the fragments of information like a puzzle. The picture was becoming clearer. Matteo was planning something significant, and it involved the top floor of the hotel. But what exactly was he planning? And who else would be there? As the day wore on, Brian and Grace exchanged updates whenever they crossed paths. Grace kept a close watch on Judy, noting every move she made, every person she spoke to. Meanwhile, Brian worked quietly, blending into the background as he gathered as much information as he could. By the time the evening approached, Brian felt the tension in the air grow thicker. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still so much they didn't know. One thing was certain: whatever Matteo was planning, it was happening soon. They had to act quickly, or they might lose their chance to stop him for good. A seasoned housekeeper named Betty, who had dedicated over a decade of her life to the Henry Plaza Hotel, pulled Brian Henry aside during her break. The worry etched on her face was impossible to miss, and her voice dropped to a near whisper as she spoke, her eyes darting nervously around the room to ensure they weren't overheard. "I don't know much," Betty began, her tone fraught with unease. "But I overheard Judy talking to one of the other managers about a late-night meeting happening in one of the private suites on the top floor. It's scheduled for tomorrow, and they're keeping it hush-hush. No one's supposed to know." Brian's heart raced at her words. The top floor of the Henry Plaza was an exclusive space, reserved only for VIP guests and confidential meetings. Its privacy and seclusion made it the perfect setting for Matteo to orchestrate something significant. If he was holding a meeting there, it could only mean one thing. Whatever he was planning, it was critical. "Did you catch anything else?" Brian asked, his voice taut with urgency. Betty shook her head, her hands wringing nervously. "Not much. But Judy's been acting strange lately, giving orders to clear out certain areas tomorrow night. Something big is going on, Brian. I can feel it." Brian thanked her, his mind already working to piece together the puzzle. A secret meeting on the hotel's top floor, combined with restricted staff access, left little doubt that Matteo was preparing to make his next move. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him. Later that evening, Brian met Grace in the staff break room. The weight of the day's revelations hung over them as they exchanged information, their expressions grave with determination. Brian relayed Betty's warning, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "A private meeting on the top floor?" Grace echoed, her brows knitting together in concern. "That's huge, Brian. If Matteo is planning to make a move, it's going to happen tomorrow." Brian nodded, his jaw tightening as he processed the situation. "This is it, Grace. Whatever he's planning, we can't afford to sit back and wait for the board to act. We need to find out what's happening during that meeting." Grace frowned, worry flickering across her face. "But how do we get up there? You know Judy will have her eyes everywhere. If we're caught—" "We won't get caught," Brian interrupted, his voice firm with resolve. "We'll find a way. Whatever Matteo's planning, we need to stop it before it's too late." The room fell silent as they both grappled with the enormity of what lay ahead. The next 24 hours would determine the fate of the Henry Plaza and the legacy Brian had sworn to protect. Brian Henry knew this was their last chance. As he and Grace stood in the dimly lit break room, the weight of the plan pressed heavily on them both. "We need to get up there," Brian said, his voice steady yet urgent. "If we can figure out what they're planning, we might be able to stop it before it's too late." Grace bit her lip, clearly mulling over the risks. "But how do we even get up there without being noticed? The top floor is off limits to everyone except specific staff. Judy will have her eyes everywhere." Brian's mind worked quickly, and then an idea struck him. What if we pose as cleaning staff? We'd have access to the entire floor, and no one would question why we're there. Grace frowned, concern evident in her furrowed brow. "That's risky, Brian. If Matteo or Judy see us, we won't get out of this unscathed." "Well, you can't. We'll be careful," Brian said firmly. "We'll wait until the meeting is in full swing, then slip in quietly. If we stay out of sight, we might be able to hear what they're planning without anyone noticing we're there." Grace still looked unsure, her hesitation clear, but after a long pause she nodded. "All right, I'll find the uniforms, but Brian, we have to be extra cautious. If we get caught—" "We won't," Brian interrupted, his tone resolute. "This is our only shot. We can't let Matteo get away with whatever he's planning." The next day felt like an eternity. Tension rippled through the Henry Plaza. as staff whispered about a mysterious event scheduled for the evening. Brian and Grace kept to their normal routines, careful to avoid drawing attention. The stakes were higher than ever, and one misstep could ruin everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Brian and Grace finalized their preparations. Dressed in the crisp uniforms of the cleaning staff, they blended seamlessly with the other employees. The plan was simple, yet perilous. Wait until the meeting began, sneak onto the top floor, and uncover the truth about Matteo's plot. By 10 p.m., the hotel was shrouded in an unusual stillness, as if holding its breath. Brian and Grace made their way to the service elevator, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might ask questions. The elevator ride was silent, the tension between them almost tangible. Both were acutely aware of what was at stake. When the doors slid open, they stepped into the opulent hallway of the top floor. The air was cooler, quieter, and the muted lighting gave the space an air of secrecy. The plush carpet muffled their cautious steps as they approached the suite where the meeting was being held. Brian could hear muffled voices from behind the door. Matteo's voice was unmistakable, low and commanding. Another voice followed, one Brian didn't recognize. His pulse quickened as he pressed his ear to the door, straining to catch every word. Grace stood beside him, her breath shallow and her eyes darting nervously down the hall. The moment of truth had arrived. Whatever was being discussed on the other side of that door could determine the future of the Henry Plaza and their lives. Brian Henry pressed his ear tightly to the door, his breath shallow as he strained to catch the muffled voices coming from the suite. The hallway around him was cloaked in silence, the plush carpet absorbing any sound of movement. Next to him, Grace leaned against the wall, her posture tense, her eyes darting toward the elevator every few seconds. The weight of the moment hung heavily between them, each passing second stretching unbearably. From inside the suite, Brian could discern Matteo's distinctive voice, low, clipped, and tinged with frustration. He was speaking with someone else, a calm and composed voice that exuded authority. Whoever it was, they didn't sound rattled by the tension emanating from Matteo. If anything, they seemed to thrive on it, their steady tone a stark contrast to Matteo's irritation. Brian couldn't place the voice, but its owner's importance was unmistakable. "We don't have the luxury of time," Matteo's voice broke through the muffled barrier, sharp and urgent. "The board is closing in. Henry's meddling is already becoming a problem. If we delay any longer, everything we've worked for will fall apart." Brian's pulse quickened. Matteo wasn't backing down even after the board's confrontation. He was doubling down, working to orchestrate an escape plan, or worse. "We can manage this," the second voice replied, its measured calm somehow even more chilling. "But it's going to take precision. We need everyone in place. If even one piece of this falls apart, it's over." Brian felt his stomach tighten as he pieced together the implications of the conversation. Matteo wasn't just trying to save himself, he was rallying others to protect his scheme, and the mention of no loose ends sent a shiver down Brian's spine. He was the loose end Matteo wanted to tie up, and the danger had never felt more real. Grace's hand lightly touched Brian's arm, her whisper barely audible. "What are they saying?" she asked, her voice filled with urgency. Brian turned to her, his expression grim. "Matteo's planning something big. He's trying to pull people into his corner, and they're talking about eliminating loose ends." Grace's eyes widened, the fear in them mirroring Brian's own. "He means you, doesn't he?" she whispered. Brian nodded, his resolve hardening. "We don't have much time. Whatever he's planning, we need to figure it out now." Brian Henry held his breath, listening intently as Matteo's voice dropped to a quieter but no less resolute tone. The words that followed sent a chill through him. "What about the staff?" Matteo said, his words deliberate, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "They've been loyal so far, but Henry's been stirring the pot. If we're not careful, they'll start turning against us. We need to make sure they stay in line." The second voice responded with a calm, calculating tone. "That's already handled. Judy is keeping an eye on everyone. She'll deal with any problems that arise." Brian exchanged a tense glance with Grace, his stomach nodding. Judy, of course, she was the one enforcing Mateo's control, silencing dissent while Mateo orchestrated his plans. Together they were far more dangerous than he had initially realized. Mateo spoke again, his voice now taut with urgency. "We can't afford any slip-ups. This has to go smoothly. The board can't suspect a thing until it's already done." Brian's pulse raced. Whatever Mateo and his accomplice were planning, they were preparing to act decisively. If the board didn't intervene soon, it would be too late to stop them. "The finances are secured," the second man said, his tone chillingly confident. "The money's already in motion. Once we finalize the transfer, we'll disappear without a trace. No one will be able to track the funds." Brian's heart pounded in his chest. They were siphoning money from the Henry Plaza Hotel, planning to vanish before anyone could uncover their scheme. The hotel would be left to collapse under the weight of their deceit. It was all Brian needed to hear. He stepped back from the door, motioning for Grace to follow him. Her face was taut with tension, but her eyes held a resolute determination. Together they retreated silently down the dim hallway, heading toward the service elevator. "We have to stop them," Brian whispered, his voice urgent as they reached the elevator. "They're planning to steal the money and disappear. If we don't act now, they'll get away with everything." Grace nodded, her expression pale but firm. "But how? They've already put everything in place. We don't even know who Mateo's partner is." Brian clenched his fists, his mind racing for a solution. She was right. Without identifying Mateo's partner, they couldn't trace the stolen funds, and with Judy keeping the staff under surveillance, confronting Mateo directly was far too dangerous. But they couldn't afford to wait. "We need to go to Marvin," Brian said at last, his tone decisive. "He's the only one who can stop this. If the board freezes the accounts, Mateo won't be able to complete the transfer." Grace hesitated, her worry evident. "But what if Mateo catches wind of what we're doing? He's already suspicious of us. If he finds out..." Brian shook his head, forcing himself to remain focused. "We don't have a choice. This is our only chance to save the hotel." Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression conflicted, before she finally nodded. "All right, let's do it." With that, they stepped into the elevator, determination fueling every step, as they ascended toward their only hope of stopping Mateo's plan. The descent to the lobby felt like it stretched on forever. Each passing floor and every soft creak of the elevator only heightened Brian Henry's sense of urgency. Time was slipping away. Mateo and his mysterious accomplice were moving fast, and if Brian didn't act soon, the hotel's fate would be sealed.